24 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I went to New York on Thanksgiving week, and we went to see the parade. And we stood over on Columbus Circle. If you're familiar with New York, you know exactly where I mean. And there's a statue there, of course, of Christopher Columbus. And I looked up at that statue in the Thanksgiving of 2017, and I thought, I've known that statue all my life, and all of a sudden, I'm thinking, I wonder if it's going to come down soon. All this talk about Columbus and whether it should come down, huh? Isn't it interesting how social sentiment seems to help, not help, but I mean change and affect how we maybe remember history differently than what we were taught. Mm-hmm. Andrew Rowen has, really done some research to really give us a different view, even still. Andrew is on the phone. He's an attorney. He's a researcher. He has this very comprehensive book called Encounters Unforeseen, 1492 Retold. He's interested in the roots of religious intolerance, and you can imagine there must have been a bunch of that going on back when Christopher Columbus and his guys arrived here. Good morning, Andrew. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Good morning, Larry, Robin. Great to be here.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from New York City, where I live, about 14 blocks from the statue you just spoke of, a bit uptown.
It was a whole year of that kind of thing. We had a whole year of people pulling down statues, and I'm trying to make a political statement. It was just something I noticed.
Yeah, that's true. What's interesting about New York is we're a very bicultural city, as you know, perhaps one of the most bicultural cities in the world. But when you get to the monuments we have, they are largely European. There aren't very many Native American monuments outside our museums.
Is that right? I didn't realize that.
No, you can see a lot of Native American history in our museums, but not in our public places or parks.
Now, here in the area you're talking to, we have a statue. It's of Chief Osceola. He was, I guess, a Seminole Indian, or what was it, Creek Indian?
Yes.
I think Seminole was the name that the Europeans gave them, but I think they called themselves Creek. But anyway, the plaque underneath it says that he was forced, and his people were forced to leave the area and live in Oklahoma. And when you read that, you think, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And whenever I've said this on an air, like a broadcast like we're doing right now, and it gets put onto YouTube, like this one will be, inevitably somebody will put a comment underneath calling me an apologist. But I don't know. I mean, that's just the way it was. And I think it was wrong. How could you not think it was wrong? It's just crazy that we did that to people.
The interesting thing, Larry, is our educational system. When I researched the book, I wanted to write a book that was bicultural. But I realized right away that my boyhood education was pretty Eurocentric. I learned the things about Columbus that are positive, and there are positive things. He was a self-made man. He had tremendous perseverance through adversity, and he was a great mariner. But his treatment of Native Americans was left to be a footnote. And in the course of my research, I, found out, I think what I should have been taught, because it's readily available in the history, what did he actually do to Native Americans? What were the formative experiences of his youth that led him to do what he did? What were the religious and political beliefs of the other European Christians and the Pope in Rome in particular, that made him think the way he did? And I don't think you should be embarrassed about not knowing the history. I kind of was embarrassed to myself because I think our educational system really has not done a good job of, at least for our generation or my generation, of telling both sides of the story. And that's why I wanted to write the book. I wanted a book that presented with equal dignity and equal gravity the people who met Columbus side by side, so you could see their thoughts, their actions, their religious beliefs, their society, side by side with Columbus and European Christianity.
So the book is listed as fiction, but it's historical fiction. So you just connected the dots, and that's why it has to be called fiction. Is that right?
Well, it really is very deeply researched over 6 years.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
It follows the primary sources closely, and because the Taínos, the peoples Columbus met in the Caribbean, didn't have a written history, I also had to resort to studies by anthropologists and archaeologists and linguists. So the way I think of the book is it's history, but fictionalized and interpolated to the extent you need to fill it in.
To tell a story,
To tell the story.
What is going to be... this is kind of a crazy way to ask the question, I guess, but after reading the book, will we want to take the statue down?
I think the book presents an accurate picture of a man who lived in the 15th century and his contemporaries, Isabella and Ferdinand, and the Taino chieftains he knew and the captives he took and enslaved. And what I think is important is that we know both sides of those history. Now, the decision on the statue is really for the mayor's commission to decide. My own view is that you have to present history to our kids, which doesn't erase it, and the Native American side has been largely erased, or was erased in my
Absolutely,
history.
Yeah.
And the European. You got to present both. So, I think decisions about whether statues should be taken down are largely local. There would never be a statue of Columbus on an Indian reservation or a population where, there were lots of people who have Taino ancestry. But for an Italian neighborhood in New York City, maybe they can have a Columbus statue.
Tell me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. What things did you discover? The book is huge, and I realize in a short interview we're never going to cover it all. But for the listeners we want to give them enough information so they get the book. What kinds of things did you discover that were surprising? Like you never in a million years expected to read about blank. What did you discover?
Well, there are two kinds of things I found out. First, I found out about the Taino culture. And there's been a reawakening in the Caribbean that many people in the Caribbean have Taino blood. There was largely a genocide, but isolated areas existed and continued to exist, and there was a lot of intermarriage, or at least intercrossing without marriage, and lots of people have Taino blood. So there's a real culture down there. The first thing that I was really surprised is how many words that you and I use that are Taino. And the fact that we've incorporated into our language. Yeah. The word hurricane is the root of hurricane. Tobacco is the Taino word.
Really?
Maíz, corn, maize, is the Taino word. Canoa for canoe. Hamaca for hammock. Barbacoa for barbecue. I could go on and on, but there are lots of words that we use today, and I don't, in our common speech, that have the roots in the Taino people Columbus.
That is interesting.
Met.
Wow. A lot of what you just said right there too is taught in schools here, as part of the indigenous peoples who used to live here. The word hammock, for example, I believe our area is called the Big Hammock or something.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a connection there with the word hammock. That's what stimulated the thought.
Well, the Europeans didn't know hammocks before they came to the Caribbean. And if you get a copy of my book, you can see one of the first drawings of a hammock by a European is right on the inside cover of it. The second thing that I learned was what a admirable society the Taínos had. Well, in our modern time, we sometimes think of ancient societies like Greece or Rome, China or India as things we can look to that, although less technologically advanced in our modern world, had aspects of their beliefs and philosophy and social practices that were admirable, and maybe we can learn something from them. Well, what I found, kind of surprising and very pleasing was the Taino society I found. Now, it wasn't as advanced technologically as having, aqueducts and coliseums and stuff like that. It was an indigenous society, but they lived peacefully among themselves. They considered food communal property and no one hungered. They didn't have religious strife or intolerance. People weren't burned at the stake for not believing in Christianity. And they sang songs to tell their culture and history. They didn't have the written word. And they had art, and they had time for leisure. They played a sport that's kind of like the predecessor to maybe a combination of soccer and volleyball, which they called Beatty, and played on a court. But it was a society
that's
which
really
was
interesting.
Civil and tolerant. It's kind of haunting that maybe it was more civil and tolerant than we are today in America.
I had a text message from a listener asking me to spell the word Taino. I looked it up. Is this right? Taino?
Yes, with an accent over the I. So, you can never really know, but I think the way they would have pronounced it is Taino.
Okay. Not to be confused with Tejano, which is like the Texan Mexican heritage. Somebody wrote something about that. Tejano, which is that's not the same the word that Andrew was saying.
When you visited most of the areas that Columbus put a foothold on, do the people over there, is he part of their history also?
Yes. When you go to the Caribbean, or at least when I went to the Caribbean, there's a whole range of views on Columbus. There are people that view Columbus as part of their Spanish heritage, and they're proud of it. There are people that view themselves as indigenous, and there's everything in between. What was interesting was I did a day in the eastern part of the Dominican Republic, below the Samana Peninsula, where I was with a government person, and they were kind of having a group therapy session, I don't know what they called it, among the people that lived in a small little village. And the session was about what are our Taino roots. And, they talked about home construction and food. A lot of the food, is the same. It's cassava-based, and fish, obviously. And, I was surprised in that discussion that it was open-ended and open to discussing Columbus not as a terrible person, but as part of what happened in the 15th century, and that's the way it was. Now, there are obviously many people down there that view Columbus akin to Hitler, and there's the other
I would
side.
imagine. So one of the things we've heard, and I'm just bouncing this off of you, not that I know any of these things, but is that Columbus may not have been so bad, but his guys were pretty bad, slaughtering children and dismembering them while they were alive. Is any of that true?
That is absolutely true. And my book ends in 1493, before the massacres begin, before Columbus brings slavery to the Caribbean, before, thousands of people die of disease and so forth. But you can see in my book a description of what happened in 1493 in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Columbus had to leave a portion of his men with the chieftain Guacangari because the Santa Maria sank, and he had only 2 ships to get back to Europe, so he left some men behind. And when he came back on the second voyage, he and others, investigated what happened to the men, but they had all been massacred. And all the European accounts attribute the massacre as being their fault. They behaved poorly. They abused women. They raped women. Instead of growing or fishing or hunting themselves, they stole food. They didn't respect the people they lived with. They denigrated their religion. And so one of the characters in my book, and I don't want to spoil it for the people who want to read it as a novel, is the first Native American chieftain to, decide that European civilization was not something that he viewed as favorable or that should be allowed to come onto the island, his chiefdom, and he massacred them. Now, when you read what happens in 1494 through 1500, Columbus's men do massacre people, and the sad thing is that Columbus lost control of the situation. He actually wanted to, at the beginning, subjugate the people peacefully to become vassals of Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. The Taínos don't want to become vassals, obviously. They reject, if they even ever knew it, that the Pope in Rome said they were Ferdinand and Isabella's vassals, and so they fought back. Then Columbus fights to subjugate them and bring slavery across. And his men and he, commenced the massacres. And there were massacres, and there were slavery, and there was almost a complete genocide. And what's interesting is when you go back to the primary sources, which are all European, of course, they describe this as a justified conquest. So it's no great feat of research to find all this out. It's right there in print as being justified. But it was I'm going to write a sequel to my book about 1494 through 6, and it was one of the lowest experiences you can imagine.
Yeah. I'm curious. The stories that you're telling, were they making their way back to Europe? And if so, were the Europeans themselves kind of up in arms and saying, "Hey, what are we doing to these people?" I mean, was there anybody saying, "Oh my gosh,
yes,
this is not right"?
Yes. Let me give you two examples. The principal historian of the period is a man named Bartolomé de las Casas, and he came over as a conquistador, but he had a conversion after living in the New World for about a decade, and he realized after hearing a sermon that what was happening was wrong, and he became, quote, the defender of Indians, and devoted his life to trying to establish their rights and to protect them, not only in the Caribbean, but in South America and Central America. Bartolomé de las Casas, the defender of the Indians. But he was a lone voice from the point of view of the chroniclers. The Pope was pretty clear. He had awarded these people to Ferdinand and Isabella. Isabella herself was disturbed and angry when she heard that Columbus had resorted to slavery. And in fact, the first slaves that Columbus sent over to Spain, she released. They were all manumitted. Wow. Now, most of them died because they were in Europe and there were European diseases, but they were manumitted. But then things got beyond Isabella, really, or she looked the other way, as maybe, generals in Vietnam did or whatever. and it just got worse. But there were a few voices.
Andrew Rowen is our guest. His book is called Encounters Unforeseen, 1492 Retold, historical fiction based on Christopher Columbus's journal. This year marks the 525th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's return to Spain after journeying to the New World. And it sounds like he went without the Santa Maria, leaving some guys behind, and that's part of that whole horror story. We've heard a few pieces, bits and pieces here and there, especially during the last year. We heard a lot of it, like during October, didn't we? Mm-hmm. From callers and people who had studied this. I have a copy of the book, so let me find somebody who would like it. You can have the copy that was sent to us. It's an advanced reader copy, so it's kind of a collector's edition. It's 500, let me see, 547 pages or something like that.
It's very well written, and it is written as a novel, so you will be involved with the characters themselves.
And that's the way I like to learn history. The rest of us have to go buy it. I did find it on Amazon. Do you have anywhere else you want to recommend that we get the book from?
Well, you can get it on Amazon. You can also get an iBook, and it is in independent bookstores. If they don't carry it, you can ask for it because there's a distributor that services them all. If you're in New York, there's a bookstore on the east side and the west side where I've signed some copies, and I can mention that. I have mentioned that on my Facebook page.
Uh-huh.
But the easiest way to buy the book is to go on my website at www.andrewrowen.com, and you have all the purchase links for all of the things you would ever want there.
I know that in our area we have. I don't know if it's newfound respect based on everything we've heard, but we have great respect for the indigenous peoples who lived here. We have storytelling events where Native Americans or people playing the role of Native Americans, whether they have ancestry or not, is not always sure. But it's really clear that they're trying to tell the story the way it really was. And so, I don't know, in this little pocket of the country, it seems like the true story is being told. Do you think that's true across the country? Do you see that everywhere?
Well, I'm in my 60s, and I know that people my age, of my background, didn't have a very good education. My kids, it's been better. My daughter, I read her learning materials regarding 1492, and they did mention the word Taino, which certainly...
Is that right? Well, that's a difference.
Yeah. So that's a difference. But I don't think... I mean, the reason I wrote my book is that for 525 years, scholars and others that have written about 1492, and it's frequently written about, haven't put in the Taino side of the story.
That is interesting, and a shame, really. Wow, that's huge. I'm glad that you are on the air with us to help us understand this and fill in some of the blanks that we never learned about. We're also in our 60s, by the way, so I'm with you. It's exactly what I learned. It's what you're expressing. Again, the book is called Encounters Unforeseen. Andrew Rowen, thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Robin.
All right, we'll be right back.